Don't touch me." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to, because the entire boardroom on the 52nd floor went still as Richard Holloway pulled his hand back from Danielle Carter like contact itself was a mistake, his fingers brushing against a folded linen napkin as if to erase the moment, and somewhere along the polished walnut table a quiet chuckle slipped out before being swallowed by silence. The kind of silence that carries judgment without ever saying it out loud, and Danielle stood there with her hand still extended for half a second longer than expected, not frozen, not embarrassed, just steady, as if time itself had paused to see what she would do next. Then she lowered her hand slowly, her expression unchanged, her eyes locked on Richard with a calm that didn't match the tension tightening the room, and no one noticed the subtle shift except the youngest analyst in the corner who stopped typing mid-sentence, sensing something had just gone wrong in a way that couldn't be undone. Because this wasn't just a handshake refused, it was a message delivered in plain sight, and Danielle had seen that message before, years ago, in rooms that looked just like this one, glass walls, skyline views, million-dollar conversations wrapped in polite smiles that disappeared the moment she walked in, back when she was told she wasn't a fit, when her credentials were questioned twice as long as anyone else's, when respect was something she had to earn 3 times over just to be treated like she belonged. And now here she was again, same tone, different faces, same assumption, and Richard leaned back slightly, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing unusual had happened, his voice smooth, controlled. "We run things a certain way here," he said, not looking at her directly, as if speaking to the room instead of the person he had just dismissed, and a few heads nodded, not in agreement but in habit, because no one wanted to be the one to challenge him, not in this room, not at this table, not with this much money on the line. But Danielle didn't respond right away. She didn't defend herself, didn't correct him, didn't raise her voice. She simply took a breath and let the moment settle, her gaze moving across the room, one face at a time, measuring, noting, remembering, and there was something about the way she looked at them that made a few people shift in their seats, like they were being seen more clearly than they were comfortable with. And then she reached for her phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, as if this had already been decided long before she walked into that room. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but every word landed with precision. "Go ahead and log the time," she said, eyes still on Richard. "I want this moment recorded exactly as it happened." And that was when the room changed, not loudly, not all at once, but enough that the air felt different, heavier, like something had just begun that no one there fully understood yet, least of all the man who thought he had just established control. The room did not return to normal after that, it only pretended to. Chairs shifted, laptops reopened, and someone cleared their throat as if that could reset what had just happened. But Danielle Carter remained exactly where she was, composed, present, watching, while Richard Holloway resumed his seat with the confidence of a man who believed the moment had already passed, his voice picking up again like a meeting that never lost control. "As I was saying," he began, glancing briefly toward the presentation screen, "we prioritize partners who align with our standards," and the word standards lingered in the air just long enough for everyone to understand what he meant without him needing to say it directly. A few executives nodded again, quieter this time, less certain, because something about Danielle's silence was beginning to feel deliberate rather than passive, and across the table the junior analyst, Emily Ross, hesitated before typing, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she replayed the exchange in her mind, the refusal, the tone, the way Danielle had not reacted the way most people would, and then the sentence that followed, "Log the time." That was not the language of someone trying to salvage a deal, that was the language of someone documenting a mistake. And Emily's eyes flicked up again, studying Danielle more carefully now, noticing details she had missed before, the calm posture, the absence of nerves, the way she was not trying to convince anyone of anything, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere outside this room. And meanwhile Richard continued, outlining projections, numbers, growth percentages, speaking in polished confidence, but the rhythm was slightly off, almost imperceptible, like a speaker who sensed something shifting beneath him but could not yet name it. And then Danielle moved, not dramatically, just a small step forward, placing her phone gently on the table in front of her, screen facing down, her hand resting beside it, steady, controlled. And when she spoke again her voice was even, measured. "You mentioned standards," she said, looking directly at Richard now. "I am curious, are those based on performance or perception?" The question landed softly but cut clean, and for a moment Richard paused, not because he lacked an answer, but because the room was listening differently now. He gave a small smile, practiced, dismissive. We base decisions on experience and fit, he replied, leaning back slightly, confident again. It is nothing personal, and that was when a subtle shift moved through the room, because everyone had heard that phrase before, nothing personal, the kind of sentence that hides everything behind it, and Danielle nodded once, slow, acknowledging, as if confirming something. She already knew, her eyes moving briefly across the table again, noting reactions, discomfort, silence, compliance, and then back to Richard. Of course, she said quietly, and for a second it sounded like agreement, but there was something beneath it, something unresolved, and Emily felt it immediately, her chest tightening as she realized this was not over, not even close, because Danielle was not defending herself. She was letting them continue, giving them space, enough space to reveal exactly who they were, and as the seconds stretched, the tension no longer sat on Danielle's side of the table. It had begun to spread, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building before something breaks. And still, no one in that room fully understood that the moment they thought had ended was only just beginning. Richard did not answer immediately this time, not because he could not, but because something in the room had shifted just enough to make him aware that every word now carried more weight than before, and he felt it, even if he refused to show it. So he leaned forward slightly, fingers interlocked on the table, voice steady but tighter around the edges. Performance speaks for itself, he said, and perception follows results, and it sounded polished, controlled, almost rehearsed, but Danielle did not respond with agreement. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if examining the logic from a distance, her expression calm, unreadable, and then she glanced briefly toward the far end of the table where a large monitor displayed financial projections, numbers moving in clean, predictable lines, the kind of numbers that made people in that room feel powerful, secure, untouchable. And she let her eyes rest there for a second longer than expected before returning to Richard. That is interesting, she said quietly, because perception tends to reveal more about the observer than the subject, and a subtle ripple moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to make a few people shift in their seats, because the sentence landed differently depending on who heard it, and for the first time Richard's smile did not return as quickly as it usually did. He held her gaze a second longer, trying to read her, trying to place her, because something about her presence did not match the role he had already assigned to her in his mind, and that disconnect was beginning to bother him, though he would never admit it out loud. And across the table Emily felt it too, the shift from dismissal to uncertainty, small but growing, like a crack forming beneath polished confidence, and she glanced down at her laptop again, but this time she was not typing notes from the meeting, she was searching quietly, her fingers moving faster now, pulling up internal directories, cross-referencing names, because something about Danielle Carter did not fit the pattern of someone out of place, and the more she looked, the more that feeling sharpened into something closer to realization. While back at the center of the table Richard exhaled slowly and leaned back again, trying to regain control of the room's rhythm. Look, he said, his tone softening just enough to sound reasonable, we have a full agenda today, and I do not think this conversation is productive. And there it was. The attempt to close the door without acknowledging what had happened, to move forward without addressing the moment that had already defined the room. But Danielle did not step back, she did not take the exit he offered, instead she reached for her phone again, this time turning it over so the screen faced upward, her thumb tapping once, precise, intentional, and then she placed it back down between them, her eyes never leaving his. You are right, she said, her voice even, almost agreeable, this conversation is not productive. And for a brief second it sounded like she was conceding, like she was about to step away, but then she added, just as calmly, because this was never a negotiation, and the air tightened instantly, the kind of silence that does not ask for attention but demands it, and somewhere behind Richard a notification sound broke through the stillness, then another, and another, soft at first, scattered, easy to ignore, until it was not, until multiple devices across the table began lighting up in uneven rhythm, screens flashing with alerts that no one had been expecting, and Emily's eyes widened slightly as she read the first line that appeared on her screen, her breath catching just enough to make her realize that whatever Danielle had just done, it had nothing to do with proving herself to this room and everything to do with exposing it. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard's attention shifted away from Danielle, just for a moment, toward the sound he could no longer ignore. And in that moment, the balance in the room tilted. The first alert was easy to dismiss, just a soft chime from somewhere near the middle of the table, the kind of notification executives ignore every day. but then another followed, and then 3 more in quick succession, and suddenly the rhythm was wrong, too frequent, too scattered, like something was moving beneath the surface that no one had prepared for, and one by one screens lit up, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, a glow spreading across polished wood as hands reached for phones almost in unison, and Danielle did not move, she did not look down, she did not check anything, she simply watched, her gaze steady, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for all along, and Richard noticed it, the way she remained still while everyone else reacted, and that stillness unsettled him more than the alerts themselves, because it meant she was not surprised, she was expecting this, and across the table a senior partner frowned at his screen, scrolling once, then again, his expression tightening. "This does not make sense," he muttered under his breath, but the words carried, and another voice followed, sharper now. "I am seeing a liquidity hold," and then another, "Accounts are being flagged," and the room shifted again, faster this time, no longer subtle, no longer controlled, because the numbers on their screens were not behaving the way numbers should, lines that were supposed to move smoothly were stalling, access points were returning errors, and a quiet tension began to rise, the kind that spreads before anyone is ready to acknowledge it out loud, and Emily's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, her earlier search now forgotten. As she pulled up internal systems, her eyes scanning, connecting, realizing, because the name attached to the alerts was not random, it was specific, it was targeted, and when she saw it clearly her breath caught, not loudly, just enough to make her sit back slightly, as if the screen in front of her had suddenly become heavier than it should be, and at the center of it all Danielle finally spoke again, not raising her voice, not forcing attention, just letting the words land where they needed to. "You might want to read those carefully," she said, her tone calm, almost courteous, but there was something beneath it now, something that did not ask for permission, and Richard looked down at his own phone at last, slower than the others, as if delaying the moment might somehow change it, but it did not. The screen was already filled with notifications, lines of text stacking faster than he could process them, and for the first time since the meeting began his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted half a second too long, and that was all it took for the room to notice. Because confidence does not need to disappear completely to be questioned, it only needs to hesitate, and Danielle saw it, the exact moment control slipped just enough to expose what had been underneath all along, and she did not step forward, she did not press harder, she simply let the silence stretch, let the realization build in real time, because this was never about proving anything to them, it was about showing them what they had already lost, and as more alerts continued to arrive, faster now, louder, impossible to ignore, the balance in the room did not just tilt, it began to collapse, quietly, precisely, exactly the way she intended. Richard's eyes moved across the screen faster now, no longer controlled, no longer composed, each notification stacking on top of the last like a structure collapsing in slow motion, and for a moment he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was still trying to understand what he was looking at, and that hesitation spread through the room like a signal, because if he did not understand it, then no one else did either, and the voices that followed were no longer quiet. No longer careful, "This is a system-wide restriction," one executive said, his voice tight. "These are not isolated accounts," another added, scrolling rapidly, "This is every linked asset," and the words hung heavier than the alerts themselves, because they pointed to something far larger than a technical error, something deliberate, something controlled, and across the table Emily felt it lock into place. The realization she had been circling now clear, undeniable, because the name tied to the freeze was not just Richard Holloway, it was everything connected to him, every fund, every extension. Every layer of access that had once made him powerful, and now those layers were being stripped away one by one in real time, and she looked up at Danielle again, really looked this time, seeing not just composure but certainty, the kind that does not come from confidence but from control, and at the center of the table Richard finally spoke, his voice lower now, sharper. "What did you do?" he said, not as an accusation, not yet, but as a question he was not prepared to hear the answer to, and Danielle did not respond immediately, she let the silence sit between them, let the weight of everything happening settle fully into the room before she answered. "I removed access," she said simply, her tone even, almost neutral, as if describing something routine, but nothing about the room felt routine anymore, and Richard shook his head slightly, as if rejecting the explanation before fully processing it. "You cannot just remove access to private capital," he said, his voice rising just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. That is not how this works, and Danielle held his gaze, steady, unblinking. It is when you are the source of it, she replied, and the sentence landed with a clarity that cut through every remaining assumption in the room, because for the first time the structure they had been operating under, the one that placed Richard at the center of control, began to invert, and the realization did not come all at once. It moved across faces, one by one. Hesitation turning into understanding, understanding into disbelief, and disbelief into something quieter, something closer to recognition, and Emily's scream confirmed it before anyone else said it out loud. The ownership chain, the controlling interest, the entity behind the capital flows they had all taken for granted, and she felt her breath catch again, sharper this time, because the name at the top of that chain was not Richard Holloway. It was Danielle Carter, and suddenly everything that had seemed out of place made sense, the calm, the lack of urgency, the way she had not tried to prove anything to them, because she had never needed to, and Richard saw it too, not through data, not through confirmation, but through the way the room changed around him, the way people stopped looking to him for answers and started looking at her, and in that moment the shift was complete, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because power does not announce itself when it moves, it simply relocates, and when Danielle spoke again, her voice was quiet, measured, but impossible to ignore. This meeting was never about whether I qualified, she said. Her eyes steady on his, it was about whether you did, and for the first time since the moment he refused her hand, Richard had no response. No one moved after that, not immediately, because the weight of what Danielle had just said did not land like a shock, it settled like truth, slow and undeniable, and the room that once felt controlled, structured, predictable, now felt exposed, as if every assumption that had been operating quietly beneath the surface had just been pulled into the light, and Richard sat there for a moment longer, his phone still in his hand, screen glowing with notifications he had not yet finished reading. But the urgency was no longer in the alerts, it was in the silence that followed them, because the room was no longer looking at the numbers, it was looking at him, waiting, not for leadership, but for explanation, and that difference was everything, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a strain it had not held before. This is a mistake, he said, shaking his head once as if clarity could be forced back into place. There has to be an error in the system, but even as he said it, the confidence behind the words was thinner, less certain, because deep down he already knew systems do not move like this by accident, not at this scale, not with this level of precision, and across the table one of the senior partners slowly set his phone down, his expression no longer confused but calculating. This is not an error, he said quietly, not to challenge Richard, but to state what had already become obvious. This is authorization, and that word shifted the room again, because authorization meant intention, it meant control, it meant someone had the power to make this happen and had chosen to use it, and every pair of eyes moved back to Danielle, not in curiosity anymore, but in recognition, and she did not step forward to claim it, she did not raise her voice or change her posture, she remained exactly as she had been, composed, still, letting the room come to its own conclusion without interference, because real power does not rush to be acknowledged, it allows others to realize it too late. And Emily felt that realization settle completely now, her earlier uncertainty replaced with something sharper, clearer, and she glanced around the table, noticing how quickly people had shifted, how quickly allegiance moves when certainty changes direction, and Richard saw it too, the subtle but undeniable change in where attention was placed, and for the first time his posture adjusted, not dramatically, but enough to signal that control was no longer something he could assume, and he looked back at Danielle, really looked this time, as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the position she now clearly held, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, not respectful yet, but no longer dismissive. If you are behind this, he said carefully, choosing each word with more caution than before, then you understand the consequences of freezing capital at this level, and Danielle nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the statement itself. I do, she said calmly. That is why it is precise, and the word precise carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it confirmed that nothing happening in that room was accidental, nothing was out of control, everything was exactly where she intended it to be, and the realization settled deeper, heavier, across every person present, because this was no longer about a meeting, or a deal, or even a disagreement, it was about authority, about who truly held it and who had only believed they did. And as the last of the notifications continued to arrive, slower now but no less significant, The room no longer felt like a place of negotiation, it felt like a space where a verdict had already been delivered, and Danielle had not raised her voice once to do it. The room did not speak right away after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word now felt like it would reveal too much, and for the first time since the meeting began the silence was not controlled, it was uncertain. An uncertainty in a room built on power does not sit quietly, it spreads, it shifts posture, it changes where people look and who they wait for, and no one was looking at Richard the same way anymore, because the authority he had carried into the room had not disappeared, it had been replaced, and that difference was impossible to ignore, and Danielle let it sit. She did not rush to fill the space, she did not press forward, she simply stood there, allowing the room to catch up to what had already happened, and across the table one of the partners leaned toward his screen again, reading more carefully now, slower, as if hoping the numbers might correct themselves if given enough time, but they did not. The restrictions remained, the access points stayed closed, and the pattern was clear, deliberate, consistent, and finally someone said what no one else wanted to say out loud. This is tied to your entire structure, his voice low but steady, directed at Richard, not confrontational, just factual, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest visible shift, but in that moment it carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, because it confirmed what he had been trying not to acknowledge, that this was not a temporary disruption, not a technical delay, but something far more permanent, and he exhaled slowly, placing his phone down on the table with a controlled motion that no longer felt effortless, and when he looked back at Danielle his expression had changed again, not just from dismissal to caution, but from assumption to awareness, and that awareness came with a question he could no longer avoid. Who exactly are you? He asked. And this time it was not rhetorical, it was not dismissive, it was necessary, because the room needed the answer as much as he did, and Danielle met his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. I am the reason your access existed in the first place, she said. And the simplicity of the sentence made it land harder than anything more elaborate could have, because it did not just explain what was happening, it reframed everything that had come before it, every decision, every assumption, every word spoken in that room, and Emily felt it fully now, the final piece clicking into place, because the data she had been pulling confirmed it in real time, the ownership chain, the controlling interest, the entity that sat above all of it, and it all pointed back to Danielle Carter, not as a participant in this meeting, but as the foundation of it, and she glanced around again, noticing how quickly the room had adjusted, how quickly posture changes when certainty shifts direction, and one by one the executives began to sit differently, speak less, listen more, because the hierarchy they had relied on no longer held, and Richard saw it too, the way the room had repositioned itself without asking permission, and for a brief moment something passed across his face that had not been there before, not anger, not even frustration, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have misread a situation completely, and Danielle did not interrupt that realization, she allowed it to settle, because this was not about forcing understanding, it was about letting it arrive on its own, and when she spoke again, her voice remained calm. But there was no room left for misinterpretation. You evaluated me based on what you thought I was, she said, her eyes steady on his. I evaluated you based on what you revealed, and the difference between those two things hung in the air like a line that could not be crossed back, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one in that room questioned which side of that line they were standing on. The room held its breath without realizing it, not in anticipation, but in adjustment, because everything that had once felt certain had just been redefined, and Danielle Carter did not move to claim the space she now clearly owned. She simply stood within it, as if she had always belonged there, as if nothing had changed except the awareness of everyone else, and that awareness carried weight. It shifted posture, softened voices, redirected attention, and for the first time since the meeting began no one interrupted her, no one dismissed her, no one tried to redirect the conversation, because there was no conversation left to control, only consequences to understand, and Richard sat there, still, not defeated, not yet, but recalculating, his mind moving faster now, trying to find leverage where there no longer seemed to be any, and when he finally spoke his tone had changed. Again, not confrontational, not dismissive, but measured, strategic. If you hold controlling interest, he said carefully, then you understand that this kind of disruption impacts more than just me, and the words were chosen deliberately, an attempt to widen the frame, to remind the room that this was bigger than one person, bigger than one moment, but Danielle did not challenge him, she did not contradict the statement. Instead she nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth within it. It does, she said calmly. That is why it matters how it is used, and the sentence settled deeper than anything raised in volume could have, because it shifted the focus from consequence to responsibility, and in that shift the room understood something else. This was not reaction, this was intention, and Emily felt it clearly now, the difference between someone responding to disrespect and someone revealing a system. And she glanced again at the data on her screen, the structure, the ownership layers, the permissions, all of it pointing back to Danielle not just as a participant, but as the architect of the framework they were all operating within, and the realization carried a quiet weight, because it meant the power in the room had never been where they assumed it was, it had only been visible now, and across the table one of the executives leaned forward slightly, no longer hiding his attention. You froze access before confirming alignment, he said, not accusatory, but curious. As if trying to understand the sequence rather than challenge it, and Danielle turned her gaze toward him briefly, her expression unchanged. No, she said evenly, I confirmed alignment first, and the correction was subtle but precise, because it reframed everything that had happened in the last few minutes, the handshake, the words, the tone. None of it had been random, none of it had been overlooked, it had all been observed, measured, evaluated, and that realization moved through the room like a quiet current, because it meant every action taken here had already been accounted for before anyone realized they were being seen. And Richard understood it too now, fully, completely, not as a theory, but as fact, and for a brief moment something like restraint crossed his expression, the kind that comes when a person recognizes that pushing further would not restore control, only expose more. And Danielle allowed that moment to exist without interruption, because this was not about forcing a reaction, it was about letting recognition settle into place, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same calm precision. But now there was something final beneath it, something that did not invite negotiation. You had one opportunity to define how this would go, she said, her eyes steady on his, and you made that decision in the first 5 seconds, and the simplicity of the statement left no room for reinterpretation, because everyone in that room remembered those 5 seconds, the refusal, the gesture, the assumption, and now they understood that moment was not small, it was everything, and as the silence returned, heavier than before, no one questioned it anymore. Because the outcome was no longer unfolding, it had already been decided. The silence did not break this time, it settled deeper, heavier, like the room itself understood there was no recovering what had already been revealed, and Danielle Carter did not rush to fill it, she did not step forward to dominate the space, she simply remained where she was, grounded, controlled, letting the weight of her words do the work she never needed to force, and around the table the shift was no longer subtle, it was complete. People were no longer glancing at Richard for direction. They were watching Danielle for outcome. And that difference changed everything, because authority is not just about who speaks, it is about who is waited on, and now the room was waiting on her, even in silence, and Richard felt it, not just in the way people looked, but in the way they no longer reacted to him the same way. The automatic alignment he once relied on had dissolved, replaced by hesitation, calculation, distance, and for the first time he did not try to immediately reclaim it, he sat with it, measuring his next move more carefully than before. Because whatever leverage he thought he had was no longer where he left it, and when he finally spoke again his tone carried restraint, not weakness, but awareness. If this is about evaluation, he said slowly, then there should be room for reconsideration, and the words were deliberate, an attempt to reopen a door that had already been closed, not with force, but with finality, and Danielle listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had already anticipated this moment too. And when she responded her voice did not rise, it did not harden, it remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, calm, precise, and absolute. Reconsideration applies when something is misunderstood, she said, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, not when something is revealed, and the distinction settled instantly, because it removed any remaining space for negotiation. It clarified that what had happened was not an error in communication, not a misread situation, but a clear display of judgment that had already been made, and that judgment had consequences, and across the table Emily felt the final shift lock into place, because everything now made sense not just structurally, but intentionally. Danielle had not come into that room to gain approval, she had come to observe, to confirm, to decide, and the realization carried a quiet intensity that no one could ignore, and one of the executives, older, more experienced, leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaling as if he had just understood the full scope of what had unfolded. This was never a meeting, he said under his breath, not meant to interrupt, just meant to acknowledge, and Danielle heard it, even if she did not respond to it directly, because it was true, and truth does not need repetition, and Richard heard it too, and this time he did not dismiss it, he let it sit, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to redirect, only the reality that the structure he believed he controlled had already shifted beyond his reach, and for a brief moment he looked at Danielle not as someone he had underestimated, but as someone he had completely misread. And that realization carried more weight than any loss of access could, because it exposed something deeper than power, it exposed perception, and when Danielle spoke again her voice carried that same steady clarity, but now there was something final in it, something that closed the space completely. You did not lose access because I took it, she said quietly, you lost it because you showed me exactly why you should not have had it, and the room absorbed the sentence in full, because it did not just explain what had happened, it justified it, and in that moment there was no one left in that room who could argue with the outcome, because they had all witnessed the reason for it themselves. No one spoke after that, not because the moment lacked tension, but because it had already reached its conclusion without needing another word, and Danielle Carter did not look around for validation, she did not wait for agreement, she simply let the silence confirm what had already been decided, and in that stillness the room no longer felt like a place of discussion, it felt like a space where something had been measured, judged, and finalized. And Richard sat there with that realization settling in, not all at once, but piece by piece, each second making it harder to deny what had happened, and for the first time since the meeting began he did not try to redirect the conversation, he did not attempt to regain control through language or authority, because both had already slipped beyond reach, and instead he exhaled slowly, placing both hands flat on the table as if grounding himself in what remained. And when he finally spoke his voice carried a different kind of weight, not power, not certainty, but clarity. So this is final, he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of what he already understood, and Danielle met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her tone steady. It was final the moment you made your decision, she replied, and the simplicity of that answer left no space for interpretation, because it pointed back to the very beginning, to the moment that had seemed insignificant at the time, the refusal, the gesture, the assumption. And now it stood as the defining action that shaped everything that followed, and across the table Emily felt the full arc of the situation settle into place. From the first second to this one, nothing had been random, nothing had been reactive, it had all been observed and allowed to unfold exactly as it needed to, and that realization carried a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, more contained, as if everyone present had just witnessed something far larger than a single meeting. And one of the senior executives leaned back slowly, his eyes moving between Danielle and Richard, not searching for conflict, but recognizing resolution, and the absence of resistance in the room was telling. No one challenged her, no one questioned the authority behind her actions, because the evidence was already in their hands, on their screens, in the silence that followed, and Richard saw it too, the complete shift, not just in access, but in perception, and for a brief moment he nodded once, a small, controlled motion that carried more acceptance than any words could have, and Danielle did not respond to it, because she did not need to. The moment did not require acknowledgement, it required completion, and she reached for her phone again, her movements calm, deliberate, and with a single tap the incoming alert slowed, not stopped entirely, but stabilized, as if the system itself had reached equilibrium under her control, and that subtle change reinforced what had already been understood, that everything happening in that room existed within her authority, not outside of it, and when she looked back up her voice remained even, measured, but final. This was never about removing something from you, she said, her eyes steady, it was about confirming what should never have been given in the first place, and the sentence settled into the room with quiet permanence, because it reframed the entire event not as punishment, but as correction, and in that framing there was no argument left to make, only acceptance, and as the silence returned once more, it no longer carried tension, it carried closure, the kind that does not need to be announced, because everyone present already understood that what had just happened would not be undone. The room did not move when Danielle Carter stepped back, not because they were unsure what to do, but because they understood that whatever came next was no longer theirs to control, and she did not rush toward the door, she did not make a dramatic exit, she simply gathered her phone, her tablet, and adjusted the cuff of her sleeve with the same calm precision she had carried from the moment she walked in. As if nothing about the last 20 minutes required urgency, because for her it never had, and that quiet composure made the moment heavier, not lighter, because it reminded everyone in that room that what had just unfolded was not emotional, not reactive, it was deliberate. And as she began to walk along the length of the table, her steps measured and steady, the sound of her heels against the polished floor seemed louder than anything that had been said, and no one interrupted her, no one attempted to stop her, because there was nothing left to negotiate. And halfway to the door, one of the senior executives straightened in his chair, his voice careful, respectful now in a way it had not been before. "Ms. Carter," he said, and the title carried more weight than any apology could have, because it acknowledged what they had failed to recognize at the beginning. And Danielle paused, not turning fully, just enough to signal she had heard him, and he continued, choosing his words with visible caution, "What happens next?" And the question was not about the meeting anymore, it was about the structure, the system, the future that had just shifted without warning. And Danielle let a brief silence pass before answering, her voice calm, steady, but carrying a clarity that left no room for confusion. "That depends on what you do with what you just learned," she said, and the response did not offer instruction, it offered responsibility, placing the next step back on them without softening the consequence of their actions. And she turned slightly then, her gaze moving across the room one last time, not searching, not judging, simply observing, as if confirming that everything she needed to see had already been revealed. And her eyes paused for a brief moment on Emily, just long enough for recognition to pass between them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but understood, because in a room that had chosen silence, Emily had chosen awareness, and that difference mattered more than any title. And then Danielle continued toward the door, her posture unchanged, her pace unhurried, and behind her the room remained still, not out of shock anymore, but out of reflection, because the weight of what had happened was no longer external. It had moved inward, into how each person now understood their role in it. And Richard remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead, not on her, not on his phone, but somewhere in between, where realization settles without resistance. And for the first time since the meeting began, he did not look like someone trying to recover control, he looked like someone processing its absence. And as Danielle reached the door, she paused just once more, her hand resting lightly on the handle. And without turning back she spoke, her voice even, final. "Respect is not a negotiation," she said, "it is the baseline." And then she stepped out, leaving the door to close quietly behind her, and the sound of it carried further than anything that had been said, because it marked the end of something none of them would be able to return to, not the meeting, not the structure, not the assumptions they had walked in with. And as the room remained in silence, one thing was clear, nothing inside it would operate the same way again. The door closed with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been, and for several seconds no one in the room moved, not because they were unsure what to do, but because they were still adjusting to what had just been taken from them without a single raised voice. And the absence Danielle Carter left behind did not feel like relief, it felt like exposure, as if the room itself had been stripped of something it once relied on without ever acknowledging it. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the world began to return, chairs shifted, screens lit again, but nothing resumed the way it had before, because the structure had changed. And structures do not reset just because people want them to. And across the table one of the senior executives leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished surface, staring at the numbers still frozen on his screen, not with confusion anymore, but with understanding. And that understanding carried consequence, because every line, every restriction, every paused transaction pointed back to a single reality: they had never been in control of the system they believed they operated, they had only been granted access to it. And now that access had been redefined, and Richard remained seated longer than anyone else, his posture still, his hands resting on the table where they had been moments before, but the confidence that once filled that position was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. And when he finally reached for his phone again, it was not with urgency, but with intention, scrolling slowly, reading carefully, as if each notification now carried meaning he had previously ignored. And across the room Emily closed her laptop halfway, not because her work was done, but because the room itself had shifted into something that could not be captured through data alone. And she glanced around, noticing the subtle changes in behavior, how people now spoke in lower tones, how no one laughed, how even the smallest gestures carried more awareness than before. And it became clear that what Danielle had done was not just a correction of access, it was a recalibration of culture. And that kind of shift does not fade when a meeting ends, it lingers, it reshapes decisions long after the moment has passed. and one of the partners stood slowly, straightening his jacket, not with the usual confidence, but with a measured sense of accountability. "We need to review everything," he said quietly, not as an order, but as a realization, and no one argued, because there was nothing left to defend, only something to rebuild, and Richard finally stood as well, slower than usual, his gaze moving once toward the door Danielle had walked through, not with frustration, but with recognition, because in that moment he understood something that could not be undone. The power he thought he held had never been his, it had been entrusted, and more importantly, it had been observed, evaluated, and ultimately revoked, and that realization settled deeper than any financial loss could, because it challenged the foundation of how he had operated, and as the room began to disperse, not in a rush, but in quiet reflection, there was no conversation about what had just happened, no attempt to reframe it, no effort to minimize it, because everyone present knew that would not change the outcome, and as Emily gathered her things, she paused for a brief second, looking at the empty chair Danielle had occupied, and for the first time since the meeting began, she allowed herself to fully process it, not just the authority, not just the control, but the restraint, the precision, the clarity of someone who did not need to prove anything because everything she was had already been built long before she walked into that room, and as she turned to leave, one thought stayed with her, quiet but permanent. Some people do not raise their voice to be heard, they simply change the outcome, and everyone else is left to catch up. 3 weeks later the boardroom looked the same glass walls, same skyline stretching beyond the city, same polished table reflecting the morning light, but nothing inside it felt familiar anymore, because the silence that once carried quiet assumptions now carried awareness, and awareness does not leave once it arrives, it reshapes everything it touches, and the changes were not announced with headlines or internal memos, they moved quietly, systematically, like a current running beneath the surface. Policies reviewed, access protocols rewritten, oversight expanded, not as a reaction to a single moment, but as a response to what that moment had revealed, and at the head of the table sat Richard Holloway, not in the same posture as before, not leaning back with easy certainty, but upright, measured, his hands resting still, his eyes focused not on control, but on understanding, and the difference was visible, not dramatic, but undeniable. And across from him Emily Ross now spoke where she once stayed silent, her voice steady, presenting data not just as numbers, but as responsibility, and no one interrupted her. No one dismissed her, because the room had learned what silence can cost, and what awareness demands, and as she finished her report she paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, allowing space for questions that were now asked differently, not to challenge authority, but to clarify impact. And Richard nodded once, acknowledging her point before responding, his tone controlled but no longer absolute. "We move forward with transparency," he said, and the words did not feel like a statement of power, they felt like a commitment to change, and that shift, subtle but real, echoed through the room, because everyone present understood where it had come from, even if no one said her name out loud. And in another building across the city, Danielle Carter stood near a window overlooking a different skyline, her reflection faint against the glass as she reviewed a report on her tablet, the numbers stable now, the system recalibrated, not restored to what it was, but aligned with what it should have been, and her assistant's voice came through softly from behind her, confirming that all affected portfolios had adjusted to the new structure without disruption, and Danielle nodded once, not satisfied, but certain, because this had never been about disruption, it had been about correction, and she set the tablet aside, her gaze lifting briefly toward the horizon, not in reflection, but in continuation, because moments like the one in that boardroom were not isolated, they were part of a pattern she had seen before, a pattern she had chosen not to ignore, and as she turned away from the window her voice was quiet, but carried the same clarity it always had. "We do not fix systems by reacting to them," she said, more to the room than to any one person, "we fix them by revealing them," and the statement did not seek agreement, it established direction, and back in the boardroom the meeting concluded without tension, without raised voices, but with a different kind of weight, one that came from understanding rather than assumption, and as people gathered their things and stepped out into the hallway, there was no need to revisit what had happened weeks before, because its impact was already present in every decision they now made, and Emily lingered for a moment, glancing once more at the empty seat across the table, not with curiosity, but with recognition, because she understood now that power does not need to announce itself to exist, it only needs to act when it matters, and as she turned to leave, one thought remained clear, steady, and permanent. Respect is not something you offer after the fact, it is something you recognize before you ever have to learn the cost of ignoring it.